How's it going today, guys? Back with another Cubase video. I thought I'd follow up on my last tutorial on sidechaining, in which I used XFer's LFOTool to emulate the effect of sidechain compression ducking. This time I'll be showing you how to use it to modulate external parameters within Cubase. We'll start out using a VST plugin that has MIDI learn functionality, which is pretty easy to set up. Then I'll show you how to use it with a MIDI loopback driver to modulate things that don't have MIDI learn. So if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please hit that button and let's jump in. Okay, so I'll be using the same project that I used to demonstrate the sidechaining in Cubase. I've added another element, which is some kind of chord stabs here, because we'll be doing some automation on that. And then I've also added some multi-band distortion using FabFilter Saturn to kind of push the drive on the mid band on the bass, because it was very sub-low and didn't really have much going on in the mids and tops. So the bass now sounds like this. Okay, and then the chord stabs that I added are these guys right here. I've added some automation on delay and reverb with the mixes and also with the delay feedback as it transitions into the pad that we had last time. In that pad, we're using XFer LFOTool, as I demonstrated in my last video, assigned to volume automation to kind of emulate the ducking effect of sidechain compression. It's in note retrigger mode, and we're using this MIDI file here, which is in line with our kick drums, to trigger it every time the kick hits. So it ducks using this pattern here. Now, it does need to be noted that LFOTool does include all of the different filter types from XFer Serum synthesizer, so you can actually do quite a lot of filter automation within the plugin itself. So to demonstrate that, at the moment we've got MIDI channel 1, which is the kick trigger here, assigned to volume, but we can also assign it to cutoff. So if we load up, maybe a notch filter, or we could actually go for a multi-mode filter with a notch in it. If you click on here, it'll show you the filter settings here. We can set the bass cutoff somewhere down here. Oh, it's actually bypassed right now. Let's get it to a point where the bypass automation isn't there. So we can use this to set the bass cutoff frequency. This will set the modulation amount. And then we can morph between notch and bandpass here. We'll bring the drive down. We don't really want that up for now. And we'll kind of see how that sounds in context with the pad. We can also use it on this VAR, variable modulation source, to also modulate the morph. Let's see how that sounds in context with the rest of the project. So that's how you can use the internal filter. For now, I think I'm going to leave that switched off, and we're going to move on to how to use this to modulate parameters within Cubase. So what we'll do here is we'll start with the baseline. So like I said before, I've got this automation assigned to the drive within Saturn here to kind of push it up at the end of every fourth bar to give us a bit of mid-range to work with. Now if I open the insert slots here, I've added an instance of Pro Q3 with a notch filter there, and we're going to use an LFOTool to modulate that. So if I turn on this band, we'll add an LFOTool in front of it. It doesn't really matter where in the chain you have this because you have to set up the routing manually. By default, it's going to load up like this, assigned to volume, which is not what we want. It actually uses the filter settings when you're modulating external parameters. So if we change this to assign shape, maybe put it on half a bar, and we're going to want this to be in note retrigger mode. Actually, no, we'll just leave this as is for now. So what we're going to do here, if we need to set the routing of this to this plugin. So on the channel slot here for this sub bass, what we're going to need to do is assign a MIDI channel to route this into here. So if we close this automation up here to clean things up, I'm going to add a MIDI channel here underneath the bass, which we'll call LFO1. Now we want that to be coming from the MIDI output of this LFOTool. So if we go down to sub bass, insert 3 LFOTool MIDI out, that's going to be our input, and the output we want to send to sub bass, insert 4 FabFilter Pro Q3 MIDI in. So that's where that's going to be going. Now we're going to need to assign a MIDI CC, something that we're not using already. So I'm going to assign maybe MIDI CC 20, and if we add a little bit of modulation to the filter setting here, and we activate MIDI learn within this, we can select this band, click on frequency, and then when we press play, that should start being modulated by this. Okay, so we can unclick MIDI learn there now, and this now should be modulating on the bass line. You can use the cutoff slider here to set the base of the modulation point here. And you can also adjust the phase right here. So say you wanted it to start at the top, you would just set this to 25%. And that will now, or actually no, you would have to move the slider till you see it at hitting the very peak of that modulation. I think 100 should be, I think it's about 93. So that would now start at the top of the range every time this is triggered. So you can hear that's adding some notch filter sweep to that. I'll now show you how to use it on plugins that don't have MIDI learn functionality, which is a bit more convoluted and does involve downloading a MIDI loopback driver. Now the one that I use is called LoopMIDI, and it's downloadable from this website. Once you've got it installed, it'll look like this. You're going to want to add a new MIDI port, call it whatever you want. In this case, I've called it LoopMIDI, and you only need one port, and that's that setup. So now what we're going to do is I've also added a Quadrafuzz to this stab. So I'm just going to set a loop point, just looping this first 4 bars with the stabs there. In fact, let's maybe just use the, let's loop it there. What we're going to do is add another MIDI channel here. Call this one LFO2. And we're going to have to insert another LFO tool on this channel. We'll just dial in the settings again. In fact, if I remove that, we can just copy this one over. That would be easier. Now we're going to need to change the CC value, so I'll set this one to 21. And let's just reset the phase here on this. Now this one I'm going to set to envelope mode. Now the reason for that is because I only want this to trigger at certain points. So say we only wanted to modulate this last part here. What you can do is, well, first we'll route this one. So we're going to want this coming from Chord Stab's LFOTool MIDI out, and we're going to set the input to our LoopMIDI driver. Let's set this to MIDI channel 1. Now what we're going to need to do is create a generic remote. So if you go into your studio settings or device settings, the setup here, we'll go up to remote devices, add a new one, a generic remote. So we'll call this LFO2. We're going to want the address to be MIDI CC21. And then down here we'll set the settings. So we're going to want this to go to the mixer, to chord stabs, and we'll go to the Quadrafuzz insert on drive 3 and apply. Another thing to note there is you're going to want on the generic remote, you're going to want the MIDI input to be your LoopMIDI driver. Okay, so with that set up, what we're going to do now is have a look at the Quadrafuzz settings. So in this case, I think I'm going to bypass the bands that we're not using. I'm just going to be trying to drive the high mids of that stab with some automation. So on this LFO tool here, I think we're going to slow this way down, maybe to 2 bars, something like that. So what we're going to need to do is actually add another MIDI channel for this to respond to. So this one we'll call trigger. We'll add a track. Now, say we only want it to trigger on this second 2 bars here. What we can do is actually add some MIDI notes here. On the second 8 bars. And we'll set this, it's actually on a 2-bar modulation, so we'll set it to 2 bars long here. Draw in 4 of those. And then what we're going to need to do is assign the routing on here. We don't need a MIDI input, but we need the output to be going to our Chord Stab's LFOTool MIDI in. So then, if we start this back from the beginning, this modulation on this drive knob within Quadrafuzz should only start on that second 8 bars. Okay, so that's how you set up LFOTool as an external modulation source. It's much easier to do with plugins that have MIDI learn functionality. Another way that you can go about it is assigning these to quick controls. Because this one I think is already being modulated by MIDI, maybe we can't. See, these ones can be assigned to quick controls over here. And then you can also use LFOTool to modulate quick controls. So say we wanted to do that on this one, you would just assign drive 2 to quick control slot 1. The correct channel here, that should be assigned now over here. And then what we could do is within our generic remote, instead of setting it to there, you can close out of this insert menu, go to quick controls, quick control 1. And it should modulate it that way. If we apply, close, turn this on. You would still have to set up the trigger if you want it to respond to MIDI, and you'd still have to set a MIDI track to the loopback driver for this to work with a plugin that doesn't have MIDI learn functionality. Okay guys, that's it for another video. Hopefully this was helpful. I've been really loving LFOTool. It's quite a new plugin to me, but I find it much better, especially for sine shape automation. I mean, you could say on this sub bass here, what we could have done is added a automation lane for that FabFilter Pro Q band 1 frequency. And if we expand this, what you could also do is put it on the sine shape tool. By default, this will just be on the line tool. But if we put it on sine, you could just draw in your automation data like this. The problem with that is it always defaults to the bottom or the top of the modulation parameter. You can't get it to start in the middle of the phase there. You can change the amount. If you hold down Shift and drag, this will double in length basically. Or if you wanted it to be even slower, we could take it to 16 bars, and then we get a 4-bar modulation. So that's one way of doing it, and then you can use your range selection tool here to kind of scale it. And you can also kind of compress the modulation depth and stuff here. But I just find it much easier to dial in using the control settings of LFOTool, because if we open that up again on this trigger one here, you can basically just dial in your modulation amount using, as you can see, the drive knob on that second band there, responding to where we set the cutoff frequency, and then your depth is controlled right here. So you're doing it all with 2 sliders. You can also adjust the starting phase. You can change the rate very quickly here. So for kind of sine modulations on things, I definitely prefer to use LFOTool. It can be a bit of a pain to set up, but it's definitely easier to adjust once you've got your modulation data drawn in than it is using the sine tool in the automation lanes. So I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching. Once again, please do subscribe if this was helpful to you. Peace out, guys.